Before we actually get into this, I'll put a little bit of context around it. You represent one of the winners of the HITLAB Breakthrough Alliance challenge that we concluded last fall at our summit meeting. And so thank you both for being an applicant and a challenge member, and more importantly, congratulations. We're glad that you were up there on the stage along with a couple of other winning organizations.
Thank you.
But it would be interesting if you could kind of give us a quick summary of your background and a little bit of a summary of your business, and then we can drill a little more deeply into the things that you're solving and how they're bringing potential value to the needs of the population at large.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Savan Devani, and I like to think of myself as a lifelong bioengineer. I studied bioengineering undergrad and grad school, and then I got drawn to the business side of things on Wall Street, but covering biotech, medtech, and diagnostics. So I've always been focused, and that business background really gave me a lot of skills. And then after a personal calamity, I realized, healthcare is so broken. It took me that long to realize it. And then I decided to come back to my bioengineering roots and start BioTrillion.
Well, that's a great story, and and the one thing I would add to your story is that my early undergraduate work was in chemical engineering. Before I found that I loved studying it, I hated doing it. I ended up going on to the MBA. But one of the first things
you had to think
was if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. All right, and so that's.
I'm so glad you used the word measure, because that's part of the theme that we're going to be discussing.
Well, that's exactly what I was trying to do, is build the bridge into our discussion. And so, the challenge in healthcare, of course, is the initial examination and focusing on the potential problem that you're trying to solve with a patient or the community of patients around a therapeutic need. So I'm curious about how you go about setting up that stage for scaling healthcare monitoring. How does your platform measure biomarkers, but more importantly, measure them so quickly to be able to give you that, what I'd call more focused diagnosis?
Yeah, absolutely. So you use the word scale, and when we think of the word scale, digital often comes to mind as one of the counterparts to the physical world. And so healthcare has been historically defined by physical constraints, devices that must be worn, touched, used in clinical settings. Even the clinical setting itself is a physical centralized location. And our innovation is to eliminate those constraints. And so we start with the smartphone, because it's almost like everyone's third limb. 5 billion people in the world have one. And we want to turn that into a health monitor. And so with the advent of AI and powerful new techniques, especially in computer vision, we train that smartphone, software only, to measure these milliscale physiologic changes in the eyes and face, because that's where the phone and the face interact passively 100 times a day. Contrast that with 1 time per year in a physical setting. And we use that what are called our BioEngine 40 is our platform to measure a variety of biomarkers, all based on clinically known endpoints or signs of disease. So take heart rate, hand tremor, pupil dilation, and we do this from a 10-second selfie video. And so I can get into more detail, but that's the essence of it. We call it a healthy selfie.
Well, you've got the tagline down pat. I love it. And so rather than delve more deeply into how does that work, because I think a number of our participants may want to follow up on that. I'm curious about how did you discover that, and then how did you go about verifying that that was a useful way to examine the characteristics of somebody before we began to get into the diagnosis itself?
All right. Well, I hope I don't get too nerdy on you or philosophical, but I'll tell you some of the thought process. Uh, Medicine has evolved over thousands of years based on prior to technology or medical diagnostics. Doctors would use their own senses, their eyes, their ears, their hands, to observe a patient and measure clinically known signs of disease. And so think of pupil size as an example, or eye edema, or even eye saccades. A doctor would observe these things, and they still do today, oftentimes, just manually, which is really, that is antithetical to the word measure. And so what we get are very subjective, oftentimes inconsistent um, uh, points that are labeled verbally. And what we now, 5 billion of us, have a very powerful modality in our pocket. It's the optical modality of a smartphone. If you were to think of all the different modalities, acoustic, kinetic, optical, right? That optical modality we know gets better and better every year. Thank you, Apple and Samsung, for investing billions of dollars in it. But it's no longer going to be sufficient for photography or compelling enough for photography. And so now with these better cameras and other optical sensors, we can get into these really fine details, taking, say, heart rate. Let's use heart rate as an example. The way a traditional pulse oximeter works is through something called photoplasmography, PPG, where they send a light into the finger and they have a sensor to measure the absorption refraction back. And so if you think about it, when we're out in the real world, natural light is that emitter, and our cameras can serve as that sensor. And based on really complex algorithms, we can turn that into what we call remote photoplasmography and measure heart rate and other vitals. So it's a little bit of a under the hood view on one of the biomarkers.
Well, it's fascinating, and I certainly enjoy both the journey you're on, and I'm trying to imagine where it will go. And there's two dimensions of where it could go that I'm curious about. One is, assuming that this proves to be both successful from a clinical point of view and successful economically, how can this change what I call the global marketplace for strong diagnosis and early treatment across the board? Because cell phones and the cameras are ubiquitous, and so it strikes me that you're poised to enter the market of helping people globally with a very simple tool that we keep in our pocket or on our handbag. So I'm curious if you thought about that, and more
Oh,
importantly,
absolutely. That's we when I think of healthcare, I don't think of, services, diagnostics, pharma, biotech. I think of it as a continuum. And we tend to think of healthcare as either prevention or intervention, left and right. I think there's this big gap in the middle called detection that is often sort of ignored. And we know the medical setting exists on the right side, the interventional side, but our life setting is where we spend 99% of our time. So if we're only spending 1% of our life in a medical setting, hoping that at that, once a year checkup, a disease sign is observed, if not measured, we're spending 99% of our life in the dark. And so what we need to do is we need to empower consumers with tools for that 99% window when they're living their life in the life setting, at home or work. And I think we'll look back and realize there's a massive asymmetry, a massive arbitrage opportunity, if you will, to put solutions in the life setting. We all seen sort of early versions of it with, very specific biomarker-based uh, tools, but focus only on one biomarker. And if you're pre-diagnostic, you're not going to buy 10 devices. So how do we take the device that's already in our pocket and empower it with that breadth to have multiple pathway biomarkers, multimodal even, so that someone who's pre-diagnostic or even younger can still have a tool that measures potential disease signs. And so the impact, to get back to that, is extremely transformative when we think of life setting and smartphone, that 99% window, and even if it's passive, being able to capture measures every time you look at your phone is extremely transformative, not only for the consumer in being able to empower them. Our platform is called BioEngine 4D, and that 4D means digitally decentralized disease detection. So that's a clear need for the consumer, but also for the clinician. There are needs for a clinician to remotely measure a patient. If we just think of telehealth today, telehealth is no different today than a phone call 50 years ago, because it's one way in communication. It's often the patient communicating symptoms, not signs. And a doctor does not have the ability to measure the patient like they would when you go into physical medical visit. The first thing that's measured are vitals. So between the consumer side of the market or the enterprise, providers, pharma, even payers, there's tremendous opportunity for a solution like this that scales.
So I'm going to kind of take us down a final sprint to, I think, an important perspective, which is, we tend to use the word healthcare and we tend to use digital healthcare as labels or headlines. But as we know, healthcare is not uniform, it's not ubiquitous, it's not consistent. In fact, some call it fragmented, broken, inefficient, yada yada. You pick your kind of complaint. And most importantly, healthcare around the world is quite different than healthcare in the US. So that said, where can the capability you've been describing, which is the healthy selfie, fit into the world in which you've got providers and payers and patients and governmental institutions all vying for influence over the way in which money is spent in healthcare? Because it seems to me you've got an opportunity for people to be able to much more quickly understand the nature of the dilemma they feel or they're experiencing. But how does that turn into action through all of those other gatekeepers who still have a very strong influence?
Yeah, well, now, as a realist, healthcare is a very stakeholder conflicted industry. We have to play ball with the three primary stakeholders. If you provide value to them, I believe they will adopt your solution. So I mentioned providers in telehealth. They're interested in more billable services, right? So now with remote or with telehealth, every time they measure your heart rate, even when they weigh you, they bill that to as a service. Pharma needs to decentralize clinical trials. Being able to scale trials massively in a quick amount of time and measure endpoints is an extremely valuable proposition to them. And payers want to understand risk. And then I would say there's this belief that the consumer will never be a part of that healthcare journey, of their own healthcare journey. I think that's true today, but in the long term, I think that's equivalent of saying PCs are just for enterprises. right? So eventually we will decentralize to all consumers, and consumers will be able to measure early risks about their own health to then catalyze a move into the clinical setting. So that's why I say digital doctor, not meant to replace physical human doctors, but to serve as your 24/7 co-pilot, which then tells you to move into the interventional setting much earlier than you otherwise would have, and complement that digital doctor who can make a clinically confirmatory diagnosis. So that extends even down to people in villages, right, who are 100 miles away from the clinic, but all have a smartphone in their pocket and need something to triage whether they should make that journey or not.
Well, Savan, this has been a superb conversation. I'm a believer in if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I am a consumer of a variety of biometric devices that I use to measure my own health. I want to add your solution to my portfolio of measurement capabilities, and we'll have that conversation after we conclude our discussion. So thank you very much. This is
Yeah,
exciting.
absolutely.
You know, it's a potential game-changing solution for the world of healthcare. And so all I can say is God bless and look forward to more success.
Thank
Take
you. You already look at the solution every day.
care.
Thank you.